I'm Sue Miller, and I'm a flute player and band leader of Charanga del Norte, the band used in these experiments. I'm also a reader in music at Leeds Beckett University and have written about the history and practice of Cuban charanga and the Cuban flute style of improvisation. The flute is the main soloing instrument in the Cuban charanga orquesta, and the sound must dominate the ensemble. The Cuban flute style involves a high register, staccato notes, heavily tongued articulation and attack, and a clave phrasing or feel. The style involves interpretation of written parts of the arrangement and, most importantly, improvisation. Charanga is the name given to the standard charanga lineup of flute, which can be a wooden 5-key flute or the metal Boehm system flute, violins, piano, bass, güiro, congas, timbales and vocals. In the golden age of Cuban charanga, the 1950s to the 1960s, when the cha-cha-cha and pachanga styles were internationally popular, the flute, which was a 5-key wooden flute as well as the Boehm system flute, was recorded on ribbon microphone technology in a live performance setting, usually to tape.
I'm Paul Thompson, and my research interests centre around creative decision making in the recording studio. My first book, Creativity in the Recording Studio, looked at some of the musical, technical and socio-cultural aspects of commercial record production. A record production is a culmination of all of these types of knowledge in order to make these particular decisions. And so my expertise in this process is trying to assess the types of knowledge that was needed at that particular time, the 1950s and 1960s, the types of technologies that were being used, and the ways in which this technology was applied and used.
I'm Barkley McKay. I've been brought in because of my expertise with recording. I'm a recording engineer and a musician, so I've seen both sides of the glass, and I'm also now a member of staff at Leeds Beckett University. A lot of the recordings I've done over the last 20 years have been jazz-based, which has been really requiring me to act more like a live engineer, which basically you've just got a short amount of time. You have to go with whatever techniques you're used to. You don't have a lot of time for decisions, but a lot of it is about compromise with the equipment you use, which I feel would have been related to how a lot of these recordings in the 50s and 60s were done. Good technology, but quite limited technology, but working with lots of musicians at the same time, and time was of the essence. So a lot of the time I find that the knowledge that comes from working in these kind of environments, especially with musicians that sometimes can be quite problematic, means that you have to not dwell on what you have to do. And that's what I felt a lot of the engineering in those days was about: minimal techniques, good solid equipment, but at the end of the day working with what was happening at that moment in time. So, you know, finding the best form of compromise, really. But a lot of, as I say, the things that I've done in the last 20 years have related to how I've built up my expertise working with microphones, the locations, the environments, placement, making sure all the musicians can perform together at the same time without really feeling that the technology in the studio was impacting on their performance in any way whatsoever.
If we're not able to observe the sessions or speak to those who were present, we can't know for sure what the concerns of the participants were or what the conditions were actually like at the time. Instead, we have to use documentation to begin to piece together a more complete picture of the musical, technical and socio-cultural interactions that contributed to the final recording. Prior to designing and conducting experiments, we spent some time in Havana during the Easter break of 2019. We interviewed a number of musicians and engineers and asked them specifically about their experiences of recording in the studio. As part of these interviews, we asked them to draw from memory the ways in which the musicians were positioned around the studio space. We also asked them if they remember how many microphones were used, and whether or not they remembered where they were positioned in relation to other musicians. In particular, we were interested in the flute, the lead instrument in the Charanga orchestra, and the ways in which the musicians and engineers remembered where the flute player was positioned in relation to the other instruments. So the fieldwork in Havana highlighted some really interesting and important things. The first one is that the sketch done by Jose at Egrem Studios highlighted two specific microphones. The first one was the RCA 77. Originally it was the RCA 77 DX, which would have been, as a ribbon microphone, would have been figure of 8. Eventually the RCA 77 became the 77B, C, and so on. Later models allowed you to create an acoustic shadow across the back of the microphone to make it more cardioid and more focused. So this is the cardioid version, the RCA 77. The other microphone that was highlighted was the RCA 44.
And this is like a modern recreation of that type of microphone. They're quite common, and the difference between these obviously is this is what is known as a figure of 8 microphone, and ribbon microphones inherently are figure of 8 because they pick up from this side and they pick up from this side just by nature of the way it's constructed with its magnet and a very, very thin foil of aluminium sitting between. So it responds to any form of pressure from either side, and it's known as pressure gradient because as you go around the side you get some difference between the front and the back, where ultimately by the time you get to the side of the microphone you've got equal pressure on this side and equal pressure on this side, but they are anti-polarity with each other, so as a result the ribbon doesn't move. And this means great control for the recording engineer at the day, because you could point this at what you wanted, but everything from the side would be rejected. However, in a loud environment, this side would pick up all the ambience. And this is where this microphone technology come in with the cardioid. They were able to take the same concept and using mechanical means start to isolate the rear of the microphone so that it would focus at the front. Hence the term cardioid, because it's called cardioid because actually if you were to plot it on a graph, it looks like a heart, the shape of the pickup. But what this enabled us was even more directionality with the microphone, and you could focus on an instrument and reject an awful lot of the surrounding environment. Ironically, not so well to the sides as compared to this one, but what they were dealing with at the time was a large ensemble all playing at the same time. Large ensemble would fill a room, and the room would be the acoustics, would be the other musician in the room, and that's what a lot of the engineers were trying to do, was to try and get the sound of the focus of the instruments and some of the room, but controlling it. So as a result, they would rely on a similar type of mechanical technology, but a slightly different approach to directionality to try and get that control. And that's what we find fascinating here, because really that was it. That's all they had. Understanding acoustics, how good the musicians were, and how they placed these microphones. And it's got a nice figure of 8 on the front there to show it.
Although poorly documented, records show that a number of charanga acts were signed to or recorded in RCA Victor Studios in New York. In the 1950s and through to 1969, the studios were located on the ground floor of the building 155 East 24th Street. There were two studios, Studio A and Studio B. Some recordings may have also been recorded at Webster Hall, which is located at 119 East 11th Street. From 1953 to 1968, RCA Victor Records operated a notable sound recording studio here, which is famed for its acoustics. The most illuminating diagram was drawn by Egrem studio engineer Jose Perez Leroy. His setup showed a series of close microphones placed on the instruments of the Charanga Orchestra. These were either RCA 77 or RCA 44 ribbon microphones. And from this, we were able to determine the types of technologies available in the early 1960s in New York. We began by experimenting with the placement of the flute in the recording studio. We also changed the acoustics of the room, making it either more or less reflective. We found that by making the room more reflective, it created a slight slapback echo at the flute player's position. And so we chose to use a more absorptive acoustic panel setup.
Right, one of the interesting things about the experimentation right at the beginning with this discussion about getting the acoustics and getting the liveness of the room is sometimes as a technical drive, you're not always thinking of the musician yourself. And of course, when we're looking at liveness of the sound, we're thinking of the sound itself. But the sound itself is also the performance. And in this particular case with Sue, the sound of the room actually impacted on her ability to perform, made it uncomfortable. So whilst we were wanting to try and get a liver sound, that was not really helping the performance. So again, this comes back down to the art of compromise. And, you know, what we need to do and what the musician needs to do, what takes precedence. And ultimately, what the musician needs to do takes precedence. And we mustn't forget that in any of these technical approaches. We need to figure out now how you want to be doing this.
So that's why I was saying about the angle, because ideally we want to, that's part of our experimentation really, is thinking about, okay, what happens if we record it like, I mean, obviously we're going to have to think about height, but that's why they've got that mic tilted that way. That's why I was saying it changes the frequency response.
Yeah.
Using the drawing and discussion with engineer Jose Perez Leroy, the next stage of the project involves searching for and then analysing photographs of recording sessions at RCA Victor Studios. We've been unable to find any latter musicians recording at RCA Victor Studios, but fortunately, William Randolph, a leading celebrity photographer of the New York music scene, was hired to shoot several publicity pictures for Elvis Presley's first recording session at RCA on the 7th of July 1956. This session involved the recording of Hound Dog and Don't Be Cruel. And through Randolph's pictures, we were then able to get a privileged view of the RCA Victor A studio and some insight into the ways in which the microphones were set up to record the band. One of the photographs of the recording sessions with Elvis pictured the RCA 77DX suspended above the drum kit at an angle. On further investigation, we found that the foil ribbon element in a 77DX used to respond to gravitational force as the microphone is positioned or tilted. Audio engineers experienced with the 77DX typically suspended the microphone at various angles to achieve a variety of response characteristics. For example, with the microphone suspended, a slight tilt on the horizontal axis causes the ribbon to sag slightly, resulting in a noticeable boost in the lower mid-range frequencies. But you do wonder whether angling it increases sort of maybe the lower mids and whether that gives you more breath, the breathy sound that you want.
Because I like that sound.
Yeah.
But also on the drums it was tilted, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And it could well be tilted so that it doesn't get the from the cymbals.
Yeah, potentially,
There's many other reasons that they could have done that to stop certain aspects of that.
Yeah.
So I mean we're already at 2 feet there.
Yeah. So maybe we should move it back.
But that will have an impact on level, of course.
Yeah, we can just start with 3 feet and just see how that sounds in there, really.
3 feet and rising.
Yeah.
That's about right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So if we put the others up there, we can then do our little comparisons.
Okay.
So, what's the gain staging on there? It's quite roomy.
Recordings from this era were then played back over the studio monitors to create a sonic reference for the engineers and to help guide us with the placement of the microphone around the flute. The majority of the recordings used the 5-key flute, which is wooden and has a more breathy tone, and the flute player attempted to replicate this sound by tonguing the flute more forcibly. This helped to create a timbre more close to that of the 5-key flute. This is where we can think about changing the angle of that mic now.
Yeah.
We can certainly move it down a touch and then change and angle it towards. And that might also change the frequency response. Shall I just record some? Yeah.
So we might be needing to be up looking down,
Okay.
rather than so out the front.
Yes.
I mean, if we keep her playing, we have a list in front of her. She's playing. So just keep playing. We've just
Yeah.
So it's like here.
Yeah.
No. And so I wonder if that is like just slightly. So if we were to move these and do that.
Yeah.
We then experimented with the angle of the microphone and found that angling it slightly helped to increase the breathiness of the flute sound and still maintain the overall body of the sound. The reason why I think it's just like where the positioning is. If you're moving, we need to think about how much room for manoeuvre you've got, because imagine this is coming down like this. Just play. Let's play. Come back that way a little bit. Practically, it also meant that the flute player's breath wasn't directed towards the microphone's diaphragm and reduced the likelihood of plosives or popping, sounds that are produced when short bursts of air impact the microphone's diaphragm. The pipe rather than just a... Do you mean if you stand here, you can hear it?
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing that
that's the tonguing.
Yeah, but so over here, back here, you just hear the note, but up here, you start hearing all the.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what you hear when you're playing, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, in each of the experiments, era-appropriate recordings were referenced to establish a balance between the breathiness, the body, and the harmonic content of the flute sound. Yeah. Mind you, this is going through the compressors to take the insert out for the tongue.
Okay, so as well as thinking about the acoustics of the space, the angle of the microphone, the positioning of the microphone, we also had to take into consideration the processing of that signal before it hit the tape machine.
Well, the things were quite limited in those days, but of course the thing is we've got to remember about the recording process. It is working with electricity, and a lot of the times when you have things with electricity, as in an AC signal in this particular case, you can manipulate it. And one of the earliest forms of processing that they had was some form of compression, and compression was enabling us to change the dynamic range of the material that's been performed. And something like a flute would have a massive dynamic range going from quiet to loud. And so an engineer would have used a process like compression to try and get that, if we like, shaped to tape as the performance. And it's something that had to be done during the performance, not after the performance, because of the limitations of the number of tracks. Not to mention the fact that if you compressed after your recording, you would bring up the noise level of tape. So a lot of the engineering had to be decisions and active parts of the processing that were done live to the signal as it was happening. So there was no going back. So they had to know how to do it correctly. And we used a compressor on this that kind of emulates the way a lot of the compressors would have been used in the 50s and 60s, valve-based technology, optical elements that shape the way it responds to those sort of aspects. And it worked with what was known as a 3-to-1 ratio, which is quite a mild compression ratio. Basically what this means is if it's 3 times louder, it's only going to be 1 time louder at the output. But the point is, this gently kind of kept the signal into shape. But also the other nice thing about compression is it brings up some of the other elements that you don't necessarily hear in front of you, because it's bringing up the quieter elements of the performance, and it does actually enhance some of the breathiness that we would have got in the flute as well at the same time. So that's an interesting thing to think about. But these were happening discreetly whilst these performances were happening. So the sounds we're hearing from the microphone are actually part of just a sequence of events before the final listener hears it, of processing. Because of the cardioid, as opposed to the figure of 8 and, the distance factor, I think it's figure of 8 is 1.7, and the cardioids are 1.5, and an omni is 1.
Right.
We could probably put the RCA just that little bit closer.
Yeah. So it moves around.
So I reckon if we bring that one down to around about here.
Okay.
So you give this a try now in this position. And so what this will do is we're kind of fine-tuning a little bit its relationship with the surroundings here and you as well. So, as I say, I always think of a microphone as this big cone coming down like this.
Okay.
And the further away it is, the further it spreads out.
That's quite a nice visual, the cone.
Yeah. So we've actually brought everything in by about 6 inches.
Okay.
Except this one, which is nearly a foot in.
Because we started off at 3 feet.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing we're probably at 2 feet now, less maybe.
And
probably less.
I think, if you don't mind, let's take some of the... Right, we need to come this way.
We need to angle it.
Yeah, no, well, yeah, we can angle it. We'll try that. But just play, I'm just trying to... Yeah, okay.
we can do this too. Just like that. Yeah. Yeah. Give that a try.
In this project, we experimented with performance practice aesthetics and type and placement of ribbon microphones to capture the sound most valued by performers from the Cuban charanga tradition, whether Havana or New York based. These experiments have revealed that ribbon microphones do indeed give more body and warmth to the flute sound in these high registers, and that microphone distance and angle are crucial to capturing the desired sound, where breathiness, body of sound and heavy tonguing and articulation are captured without the usual shrillness that metal flutes and more modern microphone technologies produce. The Ampex tape sound is a preferred one for those performers who recorded in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Eddie Zerrigon, a Cuban 5-key flute player and bandleader of Orchestra Broadway from 1962 to the present day, stated in an interview that analogue tape was better and that today's recordings were too clinical and mechanical. These experiments with ribbon microphones and their placement enabled us to calculate angle and distance for this preferred aesthetic, a sound very different from folk styles like the Irish flute one and from classical styles where the round, smooth French school is often the tone preferred. Accentuation through hard tonguing which adheres to clave direction is fundamental to the dance imperative of Latin popular music, something the follow-on live studio recording addresses in terms of full ensemble live recording, which is covered in the next documentary. We've got this hypothesis that ribbon microphones make the charanga dance music sound more like the ear.
Yeah.
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 And I like that.
But I think the other thing, listening to some of those recordings last night, what they also introduce is a bit of distortion, and that makes things sound exciting. So it adds harmonic distortion.
Some people have said to me, I don't like the distortion. And I haven't. I'm like, what distortion?
I found a quote from there's a quote from one of the photographers who worked at Archaeology, and it said what type of tape they were using, and also
I underlined that.
Yeah, and also what speed, 15 inches per second. So I've got a little tape when we come to mix.
Owl?
Yeah.
They're all called Owl.
Yeah.
You can call me Owl.
I've got a little tape emulator plugin. I don't think it's Ampex though, but it's Xaudia. But we'll be able to.
It's really kind of everywhere, isn't it?
Yeah. Ampex was a bit.
I'm learning.
That's what Jose said. They probably used Ampex 250 or 350.
Well, that comes up
Havana.
in Chasing Sound that I've been trying to look
of
up
course.
on. Yeah.
Well, it was the main American producer of tape.
This research project focused on some of the performance characteristics and recording processes involved in producing charanga music. Hundreds of charanga records were made from the late 1950s through to the 1960s in New York, but we have little documentation, photographic evidence, and to date, only limited exploration of the production methods involved in creating these recordings. This study treated charanga recordings as archaeological artifacts, and in an attempt to gain a greater insight and understanding of the use of particular technologies and techniques, experimental archaeological methods were used to help gain greater insight into the historical context of Cuban music recorded in New York during the 1950s and 1960s.
Any product, any art form that's created has come through a process of compromise.
Yes.
End of. And that is an important underlying bedrock of all of this, as we're seeing with our technology, with the environments we're using. We have to navigate through compromises. We have a yes or no situation or a maybe.
Yeah.
And then we have to make a choice. And, we're looking back at how they did things in the 50s, but everything they did in the 50s was again through compromise, and they worked with what they've got. There was, in a sense, you could think, it's so magical when we hear it now, but when they were creating it, they're saying, look, this is all we've got.
Interviews with musicians and engineers, alongside their illustrations of studio setups sketched from memory, provided a useful starting point for developing an experimental framework in which to explore the use of particular techniques and technologies. Beginning first with the flute, a series of experiments were conducted with the RCA-77 microphone to establish the optimum placement in the room and the balance between the breathiness, the body, and the harmonic content of the flute sound. Recordings from this era were used as a point of reference to guide the sound of the charanga flute. These technologies and techniques were used as a basis to expand into the next project, which is recording the full charanga ensemble within a space. And sketches from the participants were used as a starting point for the positioning and grouping of the orchestra in the live room space. Here we've shown that different kinds of resources, materials, methods and experiments all help to gain some insight into the intentions of the musicians, the engineers and the producers of the time. Both ethnoarchaeology and experimentation may be key strategies to know the feasibility of certain techniques and assess their potential cultural significance in further studies on recorded music.